The Orin corridor was the kind of place that space forgot. It was a long, dark stretch of nothing, between two star systems filled with cold dust and old light from stars too far away to matter. No one came here unless they had to. For the Valkyrie Dominion, it was simply a road. A road that, as of 3 days ago, had human ships on it. High Prince Zorithvex stood at the wide viewing glass of his command ship, the Valkyrie Ascendant, and looked at the 6 small vessels drifting through the corridor far below. They were tiny things, long and narrow, built for speed rather than power, with weapon signatures that his sensors barely bothered to register. His fleet advisor, Scout Commander Driva, stood a few steps behind him and read from a data sheet in a quiet voice. 6 vessels, he said. Human design. Explorer class. Lightly armed. No support ships detected within 3 light hours. Their power output suggests they are on a survey mission. They have not changed course or speed since we came into range. Zorithvex did not look away from the glass. The humans, he said, were a young species. They had been in space for roughly 300 years, which was nothing by Valkyrie standards. The Dominion had been sailing between stars for 11,000 years. They had built empires. They had broken species that thought themselves strong. 6 little ships in a dark corridor were not something that required deep thought. He told Drivas to begin a standard sweep, disable their drives, board the lead vessel, and bring the crew forward for registration as subject class. If they fought back, destroy 2 of the ships as a lesson and repeat the offer to the others. It was a process the Dominion had used many times. It worked because most species, when they saw what they were up against, made the right decision quickly. Drivas gave the order. The Ascendant and its escort of 42 ships began to move. On the other side of the corridor, inside the lead human vessel called the Dauntless, a soft alarm began to sound. It was not a loud or dramatic alarm. It was the kind of sound that meant something large was coming, and the crew had been trained to hear it and move, not panic. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Price heard it from his command chair. He was a tall, thin man in his late 40s, with short gray hair and dark eyes that did not move fast but missed nothing. He had been in space for 22 years. He had seen things that would make younger officers go pale. He looked at the sensor screen in front of him, read the data that was already coming in, and was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then he pressed a button on his armrest and spoke to the ship. He told the crew they had contacts. 43 vessels, Valkyrie formation, closing from the far side of the corridor. He told them to go to combat stations, not because he expected a fight, but because it was the right thing to do. When 43 were heading toward you, he told them to stay calm and do their jobs. Then he called his second in command. Sergeant Dana Holloway was already in the corridor outside the bridge when his voice came over her earpiece. She was a short, strong woman from Montana who had spent her childhood fixing engines and her adulthood fixing everything else. She answered before he finished his sentence. Price told her to get to the communications bay and start broadcasting on emergency frequency 7. Full burst compressed, aimed at deep space, bearing 270. She asked if she should encrypt it. He said yes, standard black key, and to include their position, the contact Count in the time. She said she was already moving. The Valkyrie ships came in hard. They did not announce themselves. They did not send a message. They simply moved into weapons range and opened fire because that was how the Dominion operated. Why speak when your size says everything? For you. The first hits rocked the Dauntless hard. 2 of the 6 human ships took immediate damage. Lights flickered across the bridge. A screen on the far wall cracked and went dark. Price held onto his armrest and did not move from his chair. He watched his crew work. They were already doing what they were trained to do, reading damage, rerouting power, calling out system status in short, clear sentences. Nobody screamed. Nobody froze. He gave his orders in the same flat voice he used to order coffee. He told the helm to begin defensive. Pattern 4. He told weapons to return fire. Controlled bursts not to waste anything. He told engineering to get the shield grid back to 60% or better within 5 minutes. On the Valkyrie command deck, Drivas watched the human response and felt something he did not often feel: mild surprise. The 6 ships had not scattered. They had not tried to run. They had pulled into a tight group and were now moving in a pattern that made them harder to hit than their small size should allow. Their return fire was precise and targeted the joint points in Valkyrie hull plating, which was not lucky. That was knowledge. He reported this to Zareth Vek, who dismissed it. Desperation, the High Prince said. They are afraid and doing what afraid creatures do. Give them 10 minutes. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The humans were still there. Drivas pulled up the human vessel classifications again and read them more carefully this time. Explorer class, yes. But the weapon output was wrong for that class. Their shield tech was wrong too. These ships had been modified. They were built to look small and light and harmless, but someone had put serious work into them. He thought about that for a moment. One of his junior officers called out from across the deck. She had detected a signal burst from the lead human vessel. A long-range compressed transmission fired toward deep space. She gave the bearing. Drivas read it and felt the surprise. Come back stronger this time. He walked to Zorithvek and told him about the signal. The High Prince looked at him and then looked at the bearing on the map screen. There was nothing out there, he said. Empty space. Whatever message they sent went nowhere. Drivas looked at the screen. He looked at the humans still holding position in the corridor below. He thought about the modifications on their ships. He thought about how they were not running. He said nothing, but the feeling in his chest did not go away. Price, on the bridge of the Dauntless, watched the Valkyrie fire continue and let out a slow breath. His ship was hurt. Not badly, but hurt. He checked the time. He checked the bearing. He thought about the answer he was waiting for, the one he had trained for, the one that every scout pilot in the human fleet understood was always possible but never guaranteed. He told Holloway over the comm that they needed to hold. She asked how long. He said he did not know exactly. She asked what she should tell the crew. He said to tell them the truth, that they were doing their job and that their job right now was to stay in the corridor and not give an inch. She said she could do that. She sounded like she meant it. The Valkyrie kept firing. The 6 small ships kept holding, and somewhere out in the dark, in the direction of that signal burst, something that the High Prince had not thought to check for was already moving. 3 hours into the fight, the Dauntless looked like it had been through a storm. 2 of its rear engine panels were dark. A section of a lower deck had been sealed off after a hull breach, and the air recyclers on the port side were making a sound that no one had heard before and no one was happy about. But the ship was moving. The shields were holding at just above 50%, and every person on board was still at their station. Sergeant Dana Holloway had not stopped moving since the first hit. She went from the communications bay to the engine room to the sealed lower deck, and back again, carrying a repair kit and a tablet that showed her exactly how much was broken and in what order she needed to fix it. She did not waste time worrying about what she could not fix yet. She focused on what she could. In the engine room, 2 of her crew were trying to reroute power around a blown junction. She got on her knees beside them and helped, her hands moving quickly through the wiring while she told them what to do in short, clear sentences. When they got it working and the lights on the panel turned green, she stood up, nodded once, and moved on to the next problem. That was how she had always worked. Fix it and move. There was always something else waiting. The breach on the lower deck was more serious. A Valkyrie energy round had punched through the outer hull and taken out a storage room and most of the corridor. Beside it, 3 crew members had been in that section when it happened. 2 of them had made it to the sealed door in time. The third had not. Holloway stood at the sealed door for 2 seconds and registered that fact. Then she marked it in her tablet and moved on because the ship still needed her, and the ship was full of people who were still alive. On the bridge, Price watched the battle, the way a chess player watches a board. He did not react to each hit. He watched the patterns. He watched how the Valkyrie ships were moving and where they were placing their fire, and he looked for gaps he could use. He found a few. Not big gaps, but enough. He redirected the formation twice in the first 3 hours, small adjustments that made the Valkyrie targeting systems work harder for each shot. It did not stop the damage, but it slowed it. 2 of the 6 ships in the detachment were in bad shape. The Bridger had taken a hit to its main drive and was drifting. Its captain, a steady older man named Lieutenant Gareth Cole, reported that he had lost propulsion but still had weapons and shields. Price thought for a moment and then told Cole to hold position. He then told his own helm to bring the Dauntless alongside the Bridger and attach via magnetic clamp. It was not a standard move. It made both ships harder to maneuver, but it kept the Bridger in the fight and kept its crew from floating alone in a dead vessel. The third damaged ship was the Carver. Its captain, Captain Vera Quinn, had somehow turned serious damage into an advantage. She was running interference patterns between the other ships, drawing Valkyrie fire and then moving just fast enough that most of it missed. She flew the Carver the way some people play music, not from a set of rules but from something that had become part of her. The Valkyrie targeting systems kept trying to lock onto her and kept losing the lock half a second later. She did this for 3 hours without a break and without complaint. In the gunner bay of the Dauntless, Corporal Pete Morales was having a different kind of problem. His railgun station had jammed in the second hour. The auto system said it would take 18 minutes to clear. Morales did not wait 18 minutes. He opened the housing manually, reached in, and began cycling the jammed rounds. By hand. It was hot work, and his hands were not built for it, and after a while they were bleeding from small cuts where the metal edges caught him. He wrapped them in a rag from his pocket and kept going. He cleared the jam in 4 minutes. Then he got back on the gun and started firing again, and he was humming quietly to himself the way he always did, an old country song his grandmother used to play, and if anyone around him thought that was strange, they did not say so, because the gun was working, and that was what mattered. On the Valkyrie command deck fleet, Admiral Surith had been watching the fight with the kind of stillness that came from long experience. He had served for 40 years. He had been in battles that this engagement could not compare to in size or consequence, but something about this one was sitting wrong with him, and he was too experienced to ignore that feeling. He called one of his data officers over and asked for the current engagement time. The officer told him it was 3 hours and 14 minutes. Surith nodded and said nothing. He had expected this to be finished in 15 minutes, 20 at most, not because he was being arrogant, but because the number said it should be. 43 ships against 6. The math was simple, but the math was not producing the right answer, and that meant something was wrong with the numbers he had been given. He pulled up the human vessel files again and read them slowly. Explorer-class ships, light hull, standard armaments, survey missions. He compared what the file said to what his sensors were actually showing him, and the gap between the two was wide enough to walk through. These ships were not Explorer-class in any meaningful sense. Someone had taken the Explorer-class frame and built something else inside it, something designed to fight and keep fighting and not give up ground. He thought about who would do that. He thought about why. He thought about a species that built its military ships to look like something harmless, and he thought about what that said about how that species thought about conflict. You did not disguise your warships as survey vessels unless you expected to find yourself somewhere dangerous and wanted the other side to think you were not a threat. That was not the thinking of a weak species. That was the thinking of a patient one. He walked to Zorichvek and stood beside him for a moment, both of them looking at the battle display. Surith said quietly that he thought they should consider pulling back, not retreating, just creating distance and reassessing the contact before continuing. Zorichvek looked at him. He was not angry. He simply did not understand the suggestion. They had 6 damaged human ships against 43 Valkyrie vessels. Pull back from what exactly? Surith said he was not sure. He just did not like the way the humans were fighting. They were too calm, too organized. They fought like they were not afraid. And in his experience, small forces that were not afraid usually knew something the larger force did not. Zorichvek considered this for a moment, and then shook his head. He said to continue the engagement. He told Surith he respected his caution, but that sometimes a small force simply had good soldiers. That did not make them dangerous. It just made them impressive. Surith said nothing more. He walked back to his post and kept Watching. In the Dauntless, Price had been checking a small screen on his armrest every few minutes for the last hour. It was a receiver tuned to a specific encrypted frequency, and so far it had shown nothing. He was not worried. He was patient. But he was also watching his ship take damage and watching his crew work harder and harder to keep everything together. And he knew that patience had a physical limit even when the mind did not. Then, at 3 hours and 41 minutes into the fight, the screen changed. A single small light came on. A data packet arrived, short and encrypted. Price read it. He read it again. He let out a breath through his nose, slow and quiet, and then he pressed his calm button. He told Holloway to hold on for about 40 minutes. She asked what happened in 40 minutes. He said that was when things changed. She asked if she should tell the crew. He said she could tell them that help was on the way and that they just needed to keep the ship together a little longer. Holloway's voice was steady when she answered. She said she could do that. She said the ship was still in one piece, and the crew was still on their feet. Price said he knew. He said they were doing well. It was not the kind of thing he said often, and Holloway knew it, and she carried it with her back into the engine room and kept working. The clock was the only thing that mattered now. Not the hits, not the damage reports, not the Valkyrie formation shifting on the display screen. Price knew exactly how much time he needed, and he had it written in the back of his mind like a number on a wall, and everything he did in the next 40 minutes was aimed at one single goal: keep the ship alive long enough for the number to reach 0. He pulled the remaining 4 undamaged ships into a tighter formation around the Dauntless and the Bridger, which were still clamped together and moving as one slow unit. The Carver tucked in close on the left side. The other 3 ships, the Keld, the Prentice, and the small but stubborn Hayden, filled in the gaps. It was not a fighting formation. It was a holding formation. He was not trying to win. He was trying to last. The Valkyrie seemed to notice the change. Their fire increased. Zorthvek must have decided that the humans were grouping together because they were weakening, and he was not entirely wrong. But he was wrong about what it meant. Price was not grouping them out of desperation. He was grouping them because a tight formation was harder to pick apart piece by piece, and because every ship that was still flying in 40 minutes was a ship that would matter when the waiting was over. On the Carver, Vera Quinn was doing the kind of flying that people wrote about afterward and struggled to explain clearly. The Carver was the most exposed ship. The group sitting on the outer edge of the formation, where it could act as a buffer between the main cluster and the heaviest Valkyrie fire. She moved it in small, constant adjustments, never holding a straight line for more than 3 seconds, giving the enemy targeting systems nothing to settle on. Her co-pilot, a young man named Specialist Aaron Webb, sat beside her and called out incoming fire angles in a steady voice. He was 26 years old, and this was the biggest fight he had ever been in by a very large distance. His hands were shaking slightly on his console, but his voice was not shaking, and he called every angle on time and accurate. And Quinn used every one of them. She did not tell him he was doing well. She did not need to. The ship was still flying, and that said everything. Below in the dauntless engine room, Holloway had found one more problem. The magnetic clamp connecting the Dauntless to the bridger was running hot. If it failed, the bridger would drift free and the Dauntless would lurch sideways at exactly the wrong moment. She needed someone to get into the maintenance shaft beside the clamp housing and manually regulate the heat cycling until she could bypass it properly. The shaft was small and hot and uncomfortable. She looked around the engine room and found a young crew member named Corporal Diane Park, who was the smallest person in the room and therefore the most practical choice. Park looked at the shaft and then looked at Holloway and said she would do it. She said it without hesitation, which Holloway noted and respected. Park climbed in with a tool set and a calm earpiece and started working, calling out readings in a calm voice, while the ship shook around her from incoming fire. Park stayed in the shaft for 26 minutes. The clamp did not fail. On the Valkyrie command deck, Drevis had been checking his long-range sensors every few minutes with a regularity that was starting to attract attention. His junior officers knew his habits and they could tell when he was looking for something specific rather than just monitoring. At about the 30-minute mark before Price's deadline, one of them asked him what he was tracking. Dreva said he was not sure yet. He said there were faint readings at the far end of the corridor at the edge of sensor range, and they were possibly just stellar drift or particulate movement. But they had been there for a while and they were not changing the way natural things changed. They were too consistent, too directional. The junior officer asked if she should report it to the High Prince. Dreva said not yet. He said to keep watching and tell him if the readings got any stronger. They got stronger. At 22 minutes before Price's deadline, the readings resolved from vague shapes into something with structure. Drevas leaned forward over his console and looked at the display for a long time without speaking. His stylus, which he had been tapping against the edge of the console out of habit, went still. He told the junior officer to run the sensor data through the classification system and get him a count. She did. The system worked for a moment and then produced a number. She read it out loud. Then she read it again because she thought she had misread it. The number was the same both times. Drevas picked up his stylus and walked toward the High Prince. On the Ascendance Bridge, Zorichvek was in the middle of discussing targeting priorities for the next phase of the attack with two of his deck officers. He looked up when Drevas approached. Something in the scout commander's face made him stop talking. Drevas showed him the sensor display. He explained the readings at the far end of the corridor. He explained the classification results. He gave him the count. Zorichvek looked at the numbers. He was a sharp man. He understood sensor data. He did not ask Drevas to repeat himself. He simply looked at the display for a moment longer and then straightened up and turned to find Surith. Surith was already walking toward him. The veteran admiral had been watching his own sensor feed and had seen the same data half a minute earlier. He had spent that half-minute thinking about what to say and deciding that the direct approach was the only one left. He told Zorichvek that they had not engaged a human patrol. What they had engaged for the last 4 hours was a scout unit, a forward element, the kind of force a military sends ahead to test the ground before the main body Arrives. He said the signal the human sent 3 hours ago had been received and that what was now moving through the far end of the corridor was the answer to that signal. Zorichvek asked how many. Surith told him the current count and noted that it was still climbing as more signatures dropped out of faster than light travel. Zorichvek said nothing for a long moment. Around him, the bridge had gone quiet. Officers were looking at their screens, or at the floor, or at anything that was not the High Princess face. On the Dauntless, Price checked his receiver one more time and saw that the formation count was confirmed and growing. He put the receiver down and told his helm to hold position. Stop maneuvering. Just hold. The helmsman asked if that was wise. Price said it was not about being wise. It was about being visible. He wanted every sensor on every Valkyrie ship pointing at them right now because he wanted the enemy watching the 6 damaged ships in the middle of the corridor while something very large came up behind them. The Dauntless stopped moving. The Carver, the Kelid, the Prentice, the Hayden, and the clamped wreck of the Bridger all held position around it. 6 battered ships sitting still in the corridor as if they had nothing left to run with. The Valkyrie kept firing for another few minutes. Then the sensors on the Ascendant began screaming with new data from the far end of the corridor, and several things happened at once in the battle that had been a simple sweep became something else entirely. They came out of faster than light travel in a wave, not one at a time, not in a slow trickle, but all at once across a 400 km front that stretched from one wall of the corridor to the other and beyond it. On both sides, the Valkyrie sensors, which had been focused on 6 small ships in the middle of the corridor, suddenly had 218 new contacts to process, and they processed them the way any system does when it is given more than it was built to handle, and with obvious distress. The ships were big. Not all of them, but enough. 3 of them were enormous, the kind of vessels that change the scale of everything around them just by existing. The Valkyrie had ships that size. They had built them over centuries with the resources of 100 conquered worlds. Seeing something that large wearing human design language was the kind of thing that took a moment to understand. And in that moment, the Valkyrie bridge crews went very quiet. The lead ship of the formation was called the Resolute. It was a command vessel, long and gray, and built without decoration because the people who designed it understood that the ship's presence was its own statement. Admiral Leon Cruz stood at the forward viewport of its bridge and looked out at the corridor ahead. He could see the 6 small ships of the 7th Detachment in the middle distance holding position, and he could see the 43 Valkyrie vessels arranged around them. He looked at the damage signatures on his sensor feed and read the engagement report that had come in with Price's signal. He read it in full without rushing. Then he looked up. He was 63 years old. His hair was silver, and his face was the kind that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He had been in 3 major conflicts and more smaller ones than he kept count of, and he had learned through all of them that the moment before contact was the most important moment in any engagement, because what you said and how you said it determined everything that followed. He told his communications officer to open a direct channel to the Valkyrie command ship, not a broadcast. A direct one-to-one channel. He wanted to speak to whoever was in charge. The channel opened. There was a pause on the other end. Then a translated voice acknowledged the connection. Cruz identified himself and his rank and his vessel, and then spoke for approximately 90 seconds without stopping. He said that the 7th Scout Detachment of the United Earth Defense Command had been operating under standard survey protocols in unclaimed space when it was engaged without warning or communication by a Valkyrie fleet. He said that the entire engagement had been logged, documented, recorded on all sensors, and transmitted to 3 separate Earth military archives, as well as to the Office of the Interstellar Council observer currently stationed at Waypoint 7. He said that under the Council's contact protocols, any unprovoked military action against a registered sovereign species in unclaimed space was a violation of the basic agreement that kept the galaxy from descending into constant war. He said that he was not interested in making this moment larger than it needed to be. He gave the Valkyries 60 seconds to stand down their weapons, release all targeting locks on human vessels, and open a negotiation channel. He said this clearly, without anger, in the tone of a person reading out the terms of something already decided. Then he stopped talking and waited. Behind him, on the bridge of the Resolute, his crew worked quietly. Commander Priya Ashworth, his senior legal officer, stood at a side console with a data tablet in her hand. She had been working on the documentation for this scenario for a long time, not for this specific engagement, but for the general situation, the moment when humanity met something that decided to push first and ask later. Her tablet contained 314 pages of legal argument, treaty reference, and contact protocol. She had not needed to look at any of it. She knew it by memory. On the Valkyrie command deck, the 60 seconds felt different depending on who was living through them. Drebus counted them with his eyes on the sensor screen, watching the human formation hold perfectly still and perfectly organized. Surith spent them standing beside the viewport with his hands behind his back, looking at the Resolute. He had been in this business long enough to recognize a ship that had nothing to prove, and the Resolute had nothing to prove. Zoreth Vek spent them standing at the center of his bridge. He was not a coward. He was not a fool. He was a high prince of the Valkyrie Dominion, and he understood power. And what he was looking at right now was power arranged in a formation that left no exit he could use cleanly. He could fight. His ships were capable, but they were not capable of that. Not that size, not that number, not with the engagement data already sitting in Interstellar Council archive. Even if the Dominion won here, they would spend the next generation explaining it, and the Council penalties would be larger than the corridor was worth. He ordered weapons to stand by. He opened the negotiation channel. Cruz received the response and nodded. Once, he told his communications officer to connect Commander Ashworth and let her begin the framework discussion. Then he moved toward the viewport and looked at the 6 small ships still holding position in the corridor. He called Price on a separate channel. Price answered on the first signal. Cruz asked him how his ship was doing. Price said it had been better, but it had also been worse. Cruz said that was a useful answer. He asked about casualties. Price gave him the number. Cruz was quiet for a moment and said he was sorry for it. Price said the crew had done their job, and the job was worth doing. Cruz said he agreed. In the mess bay of the Carver, Vieira, Quinn finally sat down for the first time in 4.5 hours. She sat in a chair beside the small window and put her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at them. They were not shaking now, but they had been for a few minutes after she shut the engines down and handed the controls to Webb. She had not let anyone see that. There were things you showed your crew, and things you carried yourself, and that was one of the things you carried. Webb came in with 2 cups of something hot and set one in front of her without asking. She picked it up and drank it and did not say anything for a while. Then she said he had done well today. He said he had just called the angles. She said that was the job, and the job done well was the whole thing. He nodded, and they sat quietly together and watched the enormous shapes of the human fleet outside the window, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they had cut it very close, and they both knew it. In the dauntless engine room, Pete Morales finally stopped humming. He sat on the floor beside his railgun station with his back against the wall and his wrapped hands resting on his knees. His section chief, a tall woman named Staff Sergeant Leona Briggs, crouched in front of him and unwrapped his hands to check the cuts. She said they were not deep. He said he knew. She said he was going to need to clean them properly or they would get infected. He said he would. She said she was not asking. He said he understood. She wrapped them again with clean bandages from her kit and then sat down beside him on the floor, which was not standard procedure, and they sat there together for a few minutes while the ship settled around them and the sounds of combat that had filled the last 4 hours slowly went away. Outside in the corridor, the Valkyrie and human delegations were beginning to talk, and the words they used would shape how the next years went between their species. But in the engine room of the Dauntless, none of that felt close yet. What felt close was the floor under them, and the warmth of the ship, and the simple fact that the ship was still there, and so were they. The negotiation happened on a small, neutral station near the edge of the corridor. It was not a grand place. It was a way station, the kind built for refueling and minor repairs, with gray walls and recycled air in a meeting room that held about 12 people comfortably. Commander Priya Ashwood set her tablet on the table and powered it up and looked across at the Valkyrie delegation with the calm expression of someone who had already finished this meeting in her head and was now just going through the physical steps. The Valkyrie sent Surith to lead their side, not Zorithvek. The High Prince stayed on the Ascendant, which Ashwood read as either pride or wisdom, and decided it did not matter which. Surith sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her tablet and then at her face, and something in the way he looked suggested that he had accepted the reality of the situation faster than most would have. Ashwood laid it out plainly. The Valkyrie had engaged a human vessel in unclaimed space without provocation or communication. The evidence was thorough and had already been filed under Interstellar Council protocol. This created a liability that had a specific and documented remedy. The remedy was a formal recognition of human activity rights in the Oran Corridor, a non-aggression agreement, with penalty clauses for future violations and a council monitored review period of 3 years. She placed a copy of the full document in front of Surith. Surith read the first few pages. He did not read quickly. He read carefully, the way someone reads when they're looking for the part that makes the terms better, and when he did not find it, he looked up and asked one question. He asked whether there was any room in the document for discussion on the penalty clause levels. Ashwood said there was not. She said the levels were set by council formula based on the nature of the violation and the size of the force used, and that 43 ships against 6 placed the calculation firmly in a range that the formula did not allow her to move. She said this without apology. It was simply the truth. Surith nodded slowly. He said he would need 2 hours to consult with his command. Ashwood said that was fine. She refilled her water and worked on other documents while she waited, and the 2 hours passed, and Surith came back and signed. On the Dauntless, things were quieter, but not quite still. The crew had come down from the high tension of the fight in the way crews always do, slowly and unevenly, some people moving faster through it than others. The mess hall was full. People were eating and sitting close together and talking in low voices, or not talking at all, just being near each other, which was its own kind of language after a hard day. Holloway sat at one end of a long table with a tray of food she was working through steadily. Her left hand had a fresh bandage on it from the dislocated finger she had reset sometime in the 3rd hour and mostly forgotten about. She ate with her right hand and read through her damage report on her tablet with the same hand between bites, which was a skill she had developed over years of being too busy to do one thing at a time. Across the table, 2 younger crew members were telling each other about the moments they had been most afraid, which was something people did after fights when the fear was far enough away to look at without flinching. Holloway listened without joining in. She had her own version of those moments, but she kept them inside, not because she thought they were too private to share, but because she did not need to say them out loud to be done with them. Some people processed by talking. She processed by moving, and since there was nothing left to fix at this exact moment, she processed by eating her meal and reading her report and being quietly glad that the table was full of people. Morales was in the corner with fresh bandages and a cup of coffee, and he was humming again. A different song this time. Something slower. Nobody told him to stop. Price sat in his bunk and wrote. He had always done his after-action reports by hand first on paper before transferring them to the official system. He found it helped him think. He wrote about the contact, the engagement, the duration, the decisions he had made and why. He wrote about the bridger and the clamp, and the choice to hold rather than scatter. He wrote the casualty number clearly and did not soften it. When the official part was finished, he folded the paper and set it aside. Then he took a second piece and began a different kind of writing. It was a letter to his daughter, who was 17 and lived with her mother in Oregon and wanted to be an engineer. He did not write her often enough, and he knew it, and he thought about it most during the hours after fights when everything that was usually pushed to the back came forward. He wrote that he was fine and the ship was fine and the crew had done something worth being proud of today. He wrote that he hoped her semester was going well and that he wanted to hear about the project she had mentioned in her last message, the one involving structural alloys. He wrote that he thought about her and that he was sorry time that his job took away from being close. He wrote that he loved her. He sealed the letter and put it in the outbox and then lay back on his bunk and was asleep in about 4 minutes. In his private quarters aboard the Ascendant, Zorachvek was not sleeping. He was reading. He had pulled the full human intelligence file from the archive, not the summary Drivas had briefed him from before the engagement, but the complete file, all of it, and he was going through it page by page with the careful attention of someone who has recently discovered they were working from the wrong information. He read about human history. The part that most interested him was not the space history, not the ships and the technology and the expansion into the stars. That part he understood. Every species had that part. What he did not understand until he read it carefully was what came before. The thousands of years of conflict that humanity had fought among itself, the wars on their own world, the scale of destruction they had both caused and survived, the number of times their civilization had come close to ending and had not ended, and what they had built in the aftermath of each of those near endings. He read about the structures they created, the agreements, the institutions, the ways they organized themselves to reduce the chance of making the same catastrophic mistakes again. He read about the Defense Command and how it was built and why and what its founding document said about the purpose of a military in a civilization that had nearly destroyed itself with its own weapons. He sat with that for a while. Then he called Drivas in and asked him one question. He asked how many scout detachments humanity currently ran. Drivas pulled the file and gave him the number. It was 412. Zorachvek looked at that number. He thought about the 7th detachment and what it had done with 6 ships for 4 and 1 2 hours. He thought about 412 of those units spread across the dark between the stars, each one carrying the same training, the same equipment, the same instructions, and the same signal frequency, each one connected to the same answer, waiting somewhere behind it. He did not say anything else. Drivas waited for a moment, and then, when it became clear that the conversation was over, left the room. Zorachvek stayed where he was and looked out at the stars through his viewport. For a long time, the Valkyrie fleet withdrew from the Oran corridor before the next cycle was done. They went in good order without rush, maintaining the kind of formation that a proud military holds even in retreat, because some things are about who you are and not just what happened. The human fleet watched them go. Nobody cheered. Cruz had not expected anyone to, and he would not have allowed it anyway. This was not the kind of moment that called for that. The 6 ships of the 7th detachment fell into formation at the rear of the human group as the fleet turned toward home. The Bridger was still clamped to the Dauntless. They would separate them at the repair dock and fix the Bridger's drive properly, and both ships would fly again within a month. For now, they moved together slowly, the way things move when they have been through something and are not yet ready to come apart. Cruz watched the last Valkyrie signal fade from his sensors. He told his navigation officer to set course for the nearest waypoint and then turned toward the center of the bridge. His crew was already moving, settling into the long routines of transit, and the tension that had held everyone rigid for the last several hours was releasing itself in small ways in the slight drop of shoulders and the occasional quiet word between officers. His navigation officer asked before setting the course whether the engagement should be logged as a victory. Cruz thought about the question for a moment. He thought about the casualty count and the damaged ships and what those numbers meant to the families connected to them. He thought about Priya Ashworth's 300 pages ready and waiting before a shot was ever fired. He thought about Price and his 6 ships holding a corridor for 4.5 hours because that was the job. He told his officer to log it as a message sent and received. He said that was what it was. Then he sat down in his chair and the fleet moved and the corridor went quiet behind them and the dark filled back in where they had been, patient and vast and full of things still waiting to be understood.